We're going to jump right into the text. Open your Bibles up with me to Mark chapter 5, 21 to 43. And I just pray that as we get into and as you find that those words, can you move that over? Will just constantly resonate in your mind, resonate in your heart as we look at this passage today. Mark chapter 5, 21 through 43 is coming at the tail end of Jesus' kind of ministry, going about healing every sickness and every disease. And he did this through a series of 4 individuals, rapid fire, that has taken place. We've already seen as soon as at the parable of the sower, Jesus begins to heal by stopping the waves and the waves and the wind. He gets off the boat and immediately he's binding and releasing this demon-possessed man. And now we jump into the text in 5:21 through 43, and we have 2 more miracles, 2 more encounters with the person and work of Jesus. It reads like this in 21. It says, when Jesus had crossed over again by the boat to the other side, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the sea. One of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet and begged him earnestly, my little daughter is dying. Come and lay your hands on her so that she can get well and live. So Jesus went with him, and a large crowd was following and pressing against him. Now, a woman suffering from bleeding for 12 years had endured much under many doctors. She had spent everything she had and was not helped at all. On the contrary, she became worse. Having heard about Jesus, she came up behind him from the crowd and touched his clothing. For she said, if I just touch his clothes, I'll be made well. Instantly, her flow of blood ceased, and she sensed in her body that she was healed from her affliction. At once, Jesus realized in himself that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and said, who touched my clothes? His disciples said to him, you see the crowd pressing against you, and yet you say, who touched me? But he was looking around to see who had done this. The woman, with fear and trembling, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. Daughter, he said to her, your faith has saved you. Go in peace and be healed from your affliction. While he was still speaking, people came from the synagogue leader's house and said, your daughter is dead. Why bother the teacher anymore? When Jesus overheard what was said, he told the synagogue leader, don't be afraid, only believe. He did not let anyone accompany him except Peter, James, and John, James's brother. They came to the leader's house, and he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but asleep. They laughed at him, but he put them all outside. He took the child's father, mother, and those who were with him and entered the place where the child was. Then he took the child by the hand and said to her, Talitha cum, which is translated, little girl, I say to you, get up. Immediately the girl got up and began to walk. She was 12 years old. And at this, they were utterly astounded. Then he gave them strict orders that no one should know about this and told them to give her something to eat. When we get to these 2 stories after a series of miracle after miracle after miracle, that these are 2 different stories that are highlighting a very simple principle about trusting. You see, in verse 21, we see this synagogue leader named Jairus. And Jairus' synagogue is just simply a lay leader that is in the church. Jairus begs the Lord to heal his dying daughter, and Jesus agrees. And while they're en route, In verse 25, we see that while they were going to the house, a woman cuts in front of Jairus because she truly believes if she can just touch his clothes, she be made well. She does it, and she is healed. You see, but this delays Jesus from getting to Jairus' house and getting to his daughter. So in verse 35, we see as Jesus is kind of finally wrapping up things, the woman with an issue of blood, with the issue of blood, we hear the news. Why bother? Your daughter is dead. You see, not only did they give him the news, they also gave Jairus some advice. Why bother the teacher anymore? And as I was preparing for this message, and as I was thinking about today, I realized how close to home this hits. Those words ring true over and over in my hearts and mind. It's constantly saying, why bother? Why bother the teacher anymore? You see, it's in these moments that I can wrestle, and what's interesting is that I can relate to either one of them at times, and I feel like I'm the woman with the issue of blood who just feels like if I just press in to my circumstances, I know there's things that's going on, but if I can just press in, if I can get some time with Jesus, then all things would be made right. But then on the flip side, oftentimes that I feel more like the friends of Jairus. That instead of pressing in and seeking after Jesus, these friends came and gave Jairus some advice. They said, why bother? Why bother the teacher anymore? Jairus, your circumstance is dead. Your child is dead. There's no longer any hope. Why bother? Isn't that a question that many of us, we can easily ask ourselves? You see, it may sound different, but it has that kind of tone to it. It may be, why bother praying for a spouse? Because I'm too old and nobody wants me. It may be, why bother asking for God even to heal my marriage when my spouse doesn't even treat me well? Why bother going and talking to my dad or my mom and talking about my wounds? Because they're just going to deny it anyway. Why bother praying for children when the doctors have given me little to no odds of having? Why bother sharing the gospel with my neighbor? He ain't going to come to know the Lord. Why bother praying for cancer? Why bother praying for healing? Why bother? God's going to do what he's going to do anyway. Today, really what I want to talk about, and really what I want to encourage you to give us reason why to bother. But I also want to talk to the kind of the foundational principles of why do we, or the human psyche, of why we kind of lean to more of that understanding of why bother. And what I want to do is I want to take those 5 words and I want to break them into 3 parts. And I want to look at it in the context of this passage. When he says, why bother the teacher anymore? And so I want to look at this in 3 parts. The first part I want to look at is why bother? The second part is the teacher. And then the last part is anymore. Anymore. Because I think that each one of them says something to us. And Jesus has a response. So in this first part, why bother? You see, the recorder that goes on in our playlists, right, that is constantly on repeat, when we talk about why bother, the thought is that he's too busy. Right? Isn't this what we see in the Gospel of Mark? Even if we would just reread what we have seen. This gospel starts off with saying Christ, when Jesus had crossed over again. Then again, if we were to track Jesus' history, just in these last 2 chapters, since chapter 4, we saw Jesus getting into a boat, teaching a parable. As he's teaching the parable, trying to get some rest, he goes across. There's this wind and waves that are tearing down the boat. What ends up happening, the disciples come and wake him up and out of his sleep, and he's and he speaks to it. As soon as he gets off the boat, there's this demon-possessed man that is running rapid in the city, and he has to heal. He says, well, let's go back to the other side. So as soon as he goes back to the other side, we pick up the story again. It says, when Jesus crossed over again, and what do we see? The crowd. They found him. And it seems like there's always a crowd around Jesus. It seems like what is going on in this chapter is brought out in chapter 5 and 24, is that not only is there a crowd around him, everyone is pressing up against him. Everybody is clamoring after him. Everybody is doing something. And here you have these men and these women. You got Jairus and you have these people. You're like probably wrestling with the tension. Why bother? I see Jesus doing supernatural. I see Jesus healing everyone else. I see Jesus can do the supernatural, but why bother? What happens here is that over and over again, we see this thing that he's too busy. But it's not just that he's too busy. What's really at the core of why bother is that he is not just too busy, but he is too busy for me. For me. You see, in that, the root of that for me comes with the very core of what I would call toxic shame. Toxic shame. You see, toxic shame tells us that we are to reject our self-worth. That we to somehow deny that we were made in the image of God. That it comes from kind of the past. Of somewhere, somebody, some event, some situation that's told you that you're not worth it. And as we play this over in our mind, we basically tell ourselves that it's not worth it. I'm not worth his time. I'm not worth your time. Why bother? But you see, what I love is that Jesus gives the total flip side of this. If we were to relook at verses 25 to 29, and as we see both the characteristics of this woman and the shame probably that she has, this example of her pushing through, we see this description. And what's interesting about this description is that in the Gospel of Mark, unlike any other, it's uncharacteristically stated that this woman, we get more details about this woman than any other Gospels. Usually Mark gives less details, but in this situation, he actually gives more. And he sets this up for this woman. And what we see in verse 25, he says, she suffered from bleeding for 12 years. We also see that she, not only did she go to all the tests of many doctors, she persevered all the tests. But as she spent everything she had, she wasn't helped at all. Not only was she not helped at all, but the Bible tells us that she got worse. And there was this sense of hopelessness that is coming over the women. In verse 27, it says, having heard about Jesus. See, the first thing that when I read that, I recognized that having heard about Jesus, that this woman probably wasn't from the area that she was at. That she was an outsider coming in. The reason why I think that, because later it says she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his clothing. You see, one of the things that you got to understand is that a woman with an issue of blood was considered to be ceremonially unclean. And that this woman would have been put outside of the camp. So here's this woman, this outsider that no one knows, because if they'd known her, they wouldn't have allowed her in and amongst the people. So this woman who's traveled a great distance to come is coming in, and she sneaks in and pushes her way through because she believes that if she can just touch his clothes, that she would be made well. The Bible says immediately, instantly, her flow of blood ceased, and she sensed in her body that she was healed of her affliction. You see, what I love about this is that Jesus responds in a way to this woman who probably had a little superstition mixed in with her faith. She thought, if I can just touch. we're going to see Jesus later clarifying it wasn't the fact that you touched, it's the fact that you had faith. But in here, what I love about it is that instead of where she could have gotten caught in her feelings, caught in her the thought of being rejected, being ostracized, and that recorder being played in there, she decided to bother Jesus. And what I love is that Jesus responds. He doesn't just let it kind of go by. He could have just let it just kept on going because he was on an important journey. But there's a few things that we see Jesus is doing. And the first thing that he do is that he stopped. He stopped and he addressed the woman. In verse 30, it says, at once, Jesus realized in himself that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and he said, who touched my clothes? Jesus could have just kept on going like many of us do to address an important task. Very similar to what we see on the Good Samaritan, that many priests and Levites came across the board of ruin, and they probably was going on to do some important work for the Lord. But in the midst of that, they saw a man, but instead they kept going. That Jesus was going to heal a man's daughter. But he shows the dignity that he has that is expressed in this woman, and he stops. And instead of listening to the crowd, he ends up listening to the entire story of this woman. Verse 31, it says, his disciples said, you see the crowd pressing against you, and yet you say, who touched me? And I love that verse 32, it says, but he was looking around to see who had done this. It's sort of like, yeah. Jesus was focused. He was focused in on his mission. He was focused in on his task. Even though the disciples were probably trying to whisper in his ear, Jesus, you got to stay on task. We got a lot of things to do. You got to stay focused. Jesus sits and he listens to the entirety of her story. What I love about it is that in verse 33 it says, the woman, with fear and trembling, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell down before him. And it says, and told him the whole truth. He hears the woman's entire story. You see, the disciples here didn't get what Jesus was doing that you saw in John chapter 4. He says, I must go through Samaria. That you see here, I must stop and I must hear. And as he sits down, and that word that we read into it in verse 33 says, he told him the whole truth. Whenever you give someone dignity and you stop to address and you hear their story, what you see is that Jesus didn't want to hear just give me the fast, give me the details because I'm busy. It says he heard the whole story. And it's as if for a moment that we are in the midst of this situation with Jairus. It's like as if you forgot about what's going on with the synagogue leader and Jesus is honing in, and that you forgot that there's a bunch of crowd all around pressing up against him, that the disciples are in his ear. Jairus' daughter is in the way, and it's like you focus in on this woman as if you're the only thing that matters right now. And what's interesting about it is that Jesus does something that he never does in any other part of the Gospels. He addresses her and he says, daughter. No other place in the Gospel does Jesus address anyone as daughter. And he said to her, your faith has saved you. What I really believe Jesus is doing and what Mark is trying to illustrate here is that, see, I recognize that you've been ostracized for 12 years. I recognize that you've done everything humanly possible to try to make this right. But Jesus wants to say, I see you. I see you. You're mine. I'm here. I'm with you. That this is not just about healing. This is about becoming family. I'm with you. And as he does that, he affirms her and her faith. And it says, she believed, if I can just touch his clothes, that she would be made well. And as he says that, he goes and he says, your faith has saved you. Go in peace and be healed from your affliction. You see, right here, what's interesting about this is the word go in peace and be healed is a word that we hear often is the word shalom. He goes in and he says shalom, that there's this peace. But what I love about it, it's not just kind of this internal peace, that it's not just peace in the soul. There's a holistic peace that he says. You see, you got to understand that Jesus healing this woman from this issue of blood for over 12 years didn't just give her internal peace. What it also did is that it now gave her the ability to re-engage in social interaction. She's been ostracized from the community. It's given her the ability to come back into public worship. That it's holistically coming and says, let me give you shalom. Be healed from your affliction. That he is reassuring her that he sees you. And I'm helping you holistically. You see, he's acknowledging that there's worth in you. The worth that she was able to press by, even though in her mind the recorder was probably in her head. I've done this so many times, so many people, so many attempts, and now it's like, why bother? But she presses beyond, and she touches. But you know that oftentimes when the reason why we don't bother is because we got things to do. And we've heard it said, that if there's one thing, if we say yes to one thing, then that means we're saying no to others. And right now, the disciples are hearing, and Jairus is hearing that he's saying yes to her. And Jairus' worst nightmare comes to truth. That in the midst of all of this, we pick up and it says, while he was still speaking, the people came to the synagogue's leader's house and said, your daughter is dead. Why bother the teacher anymore? Isn't that the case? Jesus, you're too busy healing everybody else. I'm too busy hearing everybody else's testimony. I'm too busy hearing where it feels like I'm not getting those blessings. So I'm not going to bother you anymore. And there's this thing that's constantly overheard and constantly being said. But when Jesus overheard, you see Jesus running straight to the attention, and he told the synagogue leader, he says, don't be afraid, only believe. You see what I love about this? There was no indication that the synagogue leader once ever doubted. There was no indication that he was even mad because of Jesus' focus on the woman with the issue of blood. Therefore, Jesus' instruction and what we are to focus on is the instruction for us to consider when hearing the news of dire consequences. Don't be afraid, only believe. You see, those words, don't be afraid, only believe, when you have heard the news that your daughter is dead, past tense, has everything to do with that second part. Don't bother the teacher. If you see Jesus as only a teacher, then you think that he can only help with things that are living. You see, but the Bible tells us that Abraham believed God, even when he said, I'm going to do multiple things through you, that he believed that even if he killed his son and sacrificed him, that God was able to raise him up. But there's something that we recognize that if we only believe. And so right here, Mark hints at what he's going to explicitly says in Mark chapter 8, where he says, who do people say that I am? And you see, the problem with the Jairus' leaders that were coming back to him was saying that he's a teacher. And the reality is, yeah, he's right. He is a teacher, but he's so much more. He's so much more. And they only refer to him as teacher. You see, this is in the midst of, again, 4 massive miracles of Jesus showing over and over and over and over again, whether even the disciple says, what manner of man is this? You see, where the disciples recognize and understand who he really is, and God is beginning to cultivate that, it's the people, it's the outsiders, it's the gallery that oftentimes calls him just the teacher. You see, the teacher speaks to his identity, his authority, his power. And we begin to have to answer that question. And what's interesting is that the way we answer that question is expressed in multiple different ways. To the woman, it was her pressing in. To Jairus, that he talked at the beginning, but for the rest of the time, he was just silent, just trusting. But in both, that you see that faith is being elicited from them. And you also see that both situations, that when they have true encounters with Jesus, they both fall at the feet of Jesus. They recognize him then more than just the teacher. In verse 22, we saw Jairus fall at the feet of Jesus. In verse 36, the woman with the issue of blood is at the foot of Jesus. And this seems to be a typical response when we meet the real Jesus. Paul says, I become all things to all men that I might save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I might share in its blessing. You see, one of the things that we will continually have, and what we have talked about, is that Encounter, this series, is about us encountering God's story so that others can encounter him. Another way that we say is that the gospel changes people, and God uses people to change the world. You see, at various points in your life, you're going to have to wrestle with this question of who Jesus is. And you're going to have to answer for yourself. And you're going to have to realize that God doesn't have any distant relatives. That sometimes we got to come to the conclusion that my mom's faith is not enough. My brother's faith is not enough. Being around is not enough. My wife always tells me, says, listen, Dhati, listen. Just because you go work out the kids in the morning don't mean that you're working out. That you actually got to do something in order for you to be working out. You say run up and down doesn't mean you are running up and down. And that's the same thing with faith. Just because you're around others who have faith, who trust in God, who understands his faithfulness, doesn't mean you have faith. And this is why the Bible tells us in Matthew 7:21, it said 21 through 23, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the ones, on the one who does the will of my Father will be in heaven. On that day, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, didn't we prophesy in your name, drive out demons in your name, and do many miracles in your name? Then I announce to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you lawbreakers. You see, the reason why we bother the teacher and we overcome this idea that is he really able, can he really fix it, is because we have a proper understanding of who he is. He is the Son of God. He is the Alpha. He is the Omega. And that leads us to the final thing, that why bother the teacher anymore? Because the anymore now speaks to timing. Basically, the thought is that he's too late. He's too late. If you were just again to look back over these verses, you see over and over again the tape recorder that's probably in the minds of the disciples, that while he was on the sea, the disciples say to teacher, don't you care that we're going to die? While he was dealing with the demon-possessed man, they heard that he lived in these tombs and no one was able to restrain him anymore, not even with a chain. There you have this woman with an issue of blood who tried everything and her symptoms only got worse. And now finally Jairus is dealing not with a dying daughter but with a dead daughter. But Jesus says, don't fear, only believe. You see, we have to recognize what's going on here. This was probably Jairus' last-ditch effort. And the reason why I say that is that if you go back to the text, towards the end, after he tells us don't believe, what we see in verse 37, it says, he did not let anyone accompany him except Peter, James, John, and James' brother. So the first thing that Jesus did, he says that there's certain people, we gotta eliminate some of the crowd. And then when he says in verse 38, when they came to the leader's house, he saw a commotion, referring to Jesus. Jesus saw these people. They were weeping and wailing loudly. And he said to them, why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but asleep. And they laughed at him. And I always looked at that. I was just like, why are they laughing? That's a pretty odd response, to be laughing. But what you see right here is that Jairus probably already has kind of given up. That his daughter, I believe, was so sick that they say during this time what would happen is that even the poorest of all people would go, whenever there was death in the family, they would call out for people with flutes and harps and different people. And they would come and they would do wailing and weeping around to kind of talk about and mourn the death of the family. And so Jairus, here he is, he says, he's probably told his wife, I told his family members, he says, go and go get the flute, go get the people because she's about to die. I'm going to go meet this man that they're talking about, Jesus. And so as he goes, he brings Jesus. As he's delayed, then he's coming back. It's already happening. Jesus comes in and says, listen, your daughter's not dead. And here's these professional wailers, these professional weepers. They're coming in and they begin to laugh because they're detached. They're just doing their duty. They're like, man, I've been here enough. I know what this is like. I know what it's like for people to be disillusioned. But I've been here. I've done this. This is what I do. Your daughter's dead. And at this time, we determine, who are we going to believe? We're going to believe what the pundits are saying, the professionals, or are we going to believe our maker? Jesus says, stop all this commotion. And when they laughed at him, what did he do? He put them out. He took the child's father, mother, and those who were with him, and he entered the place where the child was. Then he took the child by the hand, he said, Talitha cum, which is translated, little girl, I say to you, get up. And immediately the girl got up and began to walk. There could be a ton of reasons why Jesus put them all out. But I think the point that Jesus wanted us to make, and what he wanted Jairus to understand, is that it's never too late. That I know, just like the woman who's been dealing with this for 12 years, just like the disciples who were trained fishermen who thought they were going to die, just like the people who thought they did everything they could to stop the demon-possessed men, it's never too late with me. And he calls them to trust him. He calls them to keep bothering him. And what I love about it is that Jesus is basically saying, keep bothering, keep pressing in. And he wants us to realize that we are worth his time. And the other reality is that we have nowhere else to go. And it reminds me of in Luke chapter 18 when Jesus told his disciples in the parable, and he said, talking about this idea to stay persistent and to pray and to never give up. He says, there was a judge in a certain town who didn't fear God or respect people. And a widow in the town kept coming to him saying, give me justice against my adversary. For a while he was unwilling, but later he said to himself, even though I don't fear God or respect people, yet because this widow keeps pestering me, I will give her justice so that she doesn't wear me out by her persistent coming. Then the Lord said, listen to what the unjust judge says. Will not God grant justice to his elect who cry out to him day and night? Will he delay helping them? I tell you that he will swiftly grant them justice. Nevertheless, when the Son of Man comes, he will find faith on earth. You see, this persistent widow basically determined that she's worth it. She's going to keep pestering. She's going to keep coming. She's going to keep pressing in. And my prayer is that as we read this text and as we embody what was going on, and as Jesus tells the farmer, the sower, to keep sowing seeds, even though it doesn't seem like it's producing the fruit that we thought it was going to produce, keep sowing seeds. Why? Because it's never too late. I'm never too busy. And I am able. Keep pressing in. Keep coming. Why? Keep bothering me. Keep bothering. Keep knocking because I see you. Keep praying because I can help you. Keep hoping because it's never too late. Church, we have to remember that we are worth his time. God has created us in his image. And the fact of the matter is, if we're honest, we have nowhere else to go. So we must overcome our shortcomings and trust in the Savior. Father, we're thankful